Greetings and welcome to you. I'm Bill McDowell, and there are two fellow members with me from the Norway Avenue Church of Christ, Bob Dozier and Jim Hawk. We'll be continuing today with our discussion of the topic, Kingdom Living in the Time of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Session 1 was entitled, Where Do We Start? Today's Session 2 is entitled, Reading the Old Testament. As we shared last session, we're using N.T. Wright's book, God and the Pandemic, and Where is God in the Coronavirus World by John C. Lennox as invaluable sources of guidance and Christian reflections to provide assistance in studying the present crisis. They look to the Bible for wisdom during the pandemic, and they both resist easy answers to the problem of suffering. When I was a professor teaching death and grief counseling at Marshall University, I remember reading Dorothea Soli's book entitled Suffering. It seems important here. It was published near the end of the Vietnam War, an event that interrupted America's myth of innocence 50 years before George Floyd's death interrupted it again. In it, she explores the meaning of human suffering, including Christ's suffering. She knew the dangers of theodicy, that is, the question of why a good God permits the manifestation of evil, thus resolving the issue of the problem of evil. Those who use theology to explain away the question of suffering end up justifying the status quo, numbing us from the pain of others and curbing compassionate care. But it's also dangerous to avoid theological reflection on suffering altogether. Those who seek only technological solutions, vaccines to stem a pandemic, body cameras to prevent police violence, fail to ask what our susceptibility to viruses and violence means. Sole argues in Suffering that such purely practical responses can numb us to the suffering no less than airtight theodicies do. We must find or make some kind of meaning within meaningless suffering if we're to learn from it, live well with it, and become more fully human. In times of disaster or crisis, Christians have been notoriously prone to jumping to conclusions about the nature and character of God, what God might be saying in all of this, and who is at fault for these great and terrible events. In their short, packed books on biblical wisdom and the pandemic, both N.T. Wright and John C. Lennox join Sole in rejecting the easy answers that Christians are tempted to give in to in times of tragedy. The virus is God's punishment for sin, or God's teaching tool to strengthen faith, or a tragedy that will be recompensed in heaven. And their writing show how easily biblical themes can become fodder for self-serving interpretation. N.T. Wright calls out, in fact, interpretations that spice the coronavirus with bits of revelation to provide fresh material for the lucrative end times industry. In agreement with N.T. Wright, Walter Brueggemann, who is a beloved and respected scholar by preachers and laity alike, and is professor of Old Testament emeritus at Columbia Theological Seminary, shows that the Hebrew Bible's interpretations of pestilence as a sign of God's judgment, power, or unfettered freedom do not and should not easily map into our experience with this pandemic. Brueggemann declares, "I do not think for one moment that there is any ready transfer from this narrative to our real-life crisis with the virus. The Bible does not often easily apply. The Bible does, however, invite an open imagination that hopes for best outcomes of serious academic research. At the same time, it affirms that deeply inscrutable, holy reality is in, under, and beyond our best science." Wright, Lennox, and Brueggemann agree that stretching the biblical world to encompass the coronavirus, or vice versa, distorts our experience of each. Yet all of them attempt, cautiously and confidently, to shine some theological light on COVID-19 by bringing the Bible into the conversation. So in this session, in our focus on reading the Old Testament, we will rely on Brueggemann's profound knowledge, scholarship, and teaching. In Virus as a Summons to Faith, he gives us three ways of explaining divine force. First, the transactional mode of covenant, which says that a direct causal relationship exists between Israel's behavior and historical outcomes. In a tightly ordered world, good people prosper and evil people suffer. Typically, the bad outcome takes the form of pestilence, sword, famine, and captivity. Secondly, God sometimes acts forcefully in order to bring about a specific goal. For example, he sends 10 plagues or smitings against Egypt in order to bring about the liberation of his people. Isaiah envisaged a day of Yahweh, which will terrorize the commercial military establishment in Israel. These two texts together, from Exodus and Isaiah, bespeak the capacity and resolve of Yahweh to act in massively destructive ways against any historical ordering that contradicts the intent of God. Yahweh, it turns out, has many tools of sovereignty beyond the force of love. Thirdly, God can enact in utter freedom without reason, explanation, or accountability, seemingly beyond any purpose at all. The classic example is the whirlwind speeches in Job 38. But the trajectory is also at work in the sphere of history. Yahweh does not always explain why he acts with destructive force. That's his prerogative. Brueggemann recognizes that right now we are mostly preoccupied with the practicalities of managing the pandemic, from social containment to the application of science in search of medical solutions. But there is an aspect to human investigation that is not satisfied by administration and science. We're always looking for deeper explanations. He says, our free-ranging imagination is not finally contained in the immediacy of our stress, anxiety, and jeopardy. Beyond these demanding immediacies, we have a deep sense that our life is not fully contained in the cause and effect reasoning of the Enlightenment that seeks to explain and control. There is more than that and other than that to our life in God's world. So we have to find ways of naming God in this whole thing. And to Brueggemann's mind, the message is clear. The virus is God's way of telling us that the narrative of globalism and its concert that we may master and use the resources of the earth in our indifferent indulgence will fall. It means that God will not be mocked, not by Pharaoh or by Assyria or by Babylon or by any contemporary embodiment of hubris. It seems to me that the task of the preacher or the teacher is to give expression to this deeper meaning according to our faith tradition. We may affirm that a transactional quid pro quo, that is something for something, is at work. Some practice and policies may evoke God's wrath. We may say that the negative forces of creation have been mobilized to perform the intention of the Creator God. And we must pause before God's raw holiness in a world that is not tamed by our best knowledge. N.T. Wright wrote in his book after publishing a short piece in Time magazine that lifted up lament as the proper Christian response to COVID-19. He argues that before Christians can offer solutions to the questions raised by the pandemic, we need a time of lament, of restraint, or precisely not jumping to solutions. To lament is to express deep regret, grief, or sorrow through works or action. Lament is a language that the church desperately needs to recover. And yet most Christians aren't familiar with this biblical prayer language. Our congregational singing and prayers are lament light. The book of Psalms, an ancient collection of songs and prayers from a people who were no strangers to suffering, can guide us in this practice. Psalm 88 is an example to this dark experience. My soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness. Lament in the Bible is not simply an outlet for our frustrations. Though venting may be proven to be beneficial in and of itself, a lament is a form of prayer. And prayer is not passive. Many of the laments in the Psalms are calls to action. They plead with God to pay attention to them and to act on their behalf. In fact, many Old Testament scholars identify petition as an essential element of a lament psalm. For example, the Hebrew word for hear, Shema, appears 79 times as the psalmist implores God to listen attentively to their cry. The psalmist appeals to God's character and covenant and asks for his attention and action. Brueggemann says that we have an erroneous impression about who the prophets were. The prophets, says Brueggemann, were not fortune tellers or predictors of the future, nor were they carping social critics. None of the prophets has a social program to put forward or some scheme for national betterment. Rather, the prophets can best be thought of as poets who, number one, try to get the nation to weep, and number two, try to give a new vision to the nation. Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, frequently called to God with tears to do justice to the sad faith fate of Israel. And then the prophets move beyond tears to visions. It seemed that the tears were necessary to first wash the eyes to see the vision clearly. One of these Old Testament prophetic texts, words that are not part of our modern vocabulary, is Lamentations. The book of Lamentations is a collection of poems that grieve the loss of Jerusalem that's been destroyed. In addition, at least 1/3 of the book of Psalms are songs or prayers of sadness and loss and grief and upset, so that very much of the Old Testament experience of faith is having stuff taken away from us. What's so interesting is that in the institutional church with public prayer and those who use more formal lectionary and liturgies, the whole business of Lamentations has been screened out because we don't know what to do with these depressing messages. And we don't want to, because we're part of the consumer capitalism. You're just supposed to go from triumph, to well-being, to ease, to prosperity, and you never have any brokenness. The book of Lamentations demonstrates the purpose and the power of turning to God, laying out our complaints, asking for help, and choosing to trust. This not only serves as a memorial to the destruction of Jerusalem, but it also shows us how to pray when the dark clouds of suffering roll in. The 3rd chapter contains the most well-known passages. We love reading that the steadfastness of the Lord never ceases, its mercies never come to an end. But understanding the totality of the book of Lamentations deepens our understanding of where to find hope in hardship. Brueggemann says his way of teaching this is to say that the destruction of Jerusalem is the Old Testament equivalent to 9/11. That's their 9/11. Because we have neglected the lament pieces, we are ill-equipped for the loss that we are facing in our society. We keep pretending and denying that that's not happening to us. We learn from the Psalms that biblical lament comes in many forms. Some lament is directed toward the enemy, some toward God. Some is individual and some is isolated, and some is communal and comprehensive. Lament is a response to the full range of problems in the human condition. The Psalms specifically name isolation, shame, despair, danger, physical impairment, and death as the cause for lament. And then our prayer continues with specific petition: heal us, free us, save us. Lamentation has no meaning in and of itself, but leads to petition. In fact, our lament, our petition, and our eventual praise of God fit together like hand and glove. The very attributes for which we praise God are those we invoke in times of need. And finally, our prayer ends with the expressions of hope, confidence, and trust, however muted they might be by the present situation. Lament is eschatological prayer. It always looks to the future. It may not be possible to sing praise in time of crisis, and yet the community anticipates praise even as they yearn for the resolution of the crisis. Praise is the fully expected outcome of crisis and despair. In this way, the form of biblical prayers, personal and communal, provides a model for prayers in times of crisis. Psalm 6 says, "Be gracious to me, Lord, for I am weak. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are shaking. My whole being is shaken with terror." It goes on, How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And perhaps more terrifying, because Jesus himself quoted it in his agony on the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? As we watch and wait, let us use that time of lament as a time of prayer and hope. What we hope for includes the wise human leadership and initiative which will, like that of Joseph in Egypt, bring about fresh and healing policies and actions across God's wide and wounded world. Oh, send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy, and I will praise you with the harp, O God, my God. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God.